My name is Chris Rios. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce our next speaker this afternoon. Dr. Nancey Murphy is professor of Christian philosophy at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. She received her BA from Creighton University in philosophy and psychology, and the PhD from UC Berkeley in philosophy of science, the THD from Graduate Theological Union in theology. She's the author of 10 books, including Anglo-American Postmodernity, Philosophical Perspectives on Science, Religion, and Ethics, 1997, as well as On the Moral Nature of the Universe, Theology, Cosmology, and Ethics, 1996. Her first book, Theology in the Age of Scientific Reasoning, Cornell, 1990, won the American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence. Her most recent books are Bodies and Souls, or Spirited Bodies, Cambridge Press, 2006, and with Warren Brown, Did My Neurons Make Me Do It? Philosophical and Neurobiological Perspectives on Moral Responsibility and Free Will, Oxford, 2007. She's also co-edited 12 volumes, including Evolution and Emergence, Systems, Organisms, and Persons in 2007, Philosophy, Science, and Divine Action, 2009, Downward Causation and the Neurobiology of Free Will, also in 2009, and most recently, Human Identity at the Intersection of Science, Technology, and Religion, 2010. In addition, she's produced more than 24 articles and book contributions. She's been a fellow of the National Science Foundation, won a Templeton Award, received alumnus awards from Creighton University and Graduate Theological Union, and been named one of the city's most influential people by the Los Angeles Magazine. In addition to her post at Fuller, she's also a research professor at International Baptist Theological Seminary in Prague, and she's a sought-after international speaker who's delivered feature presentations at events from Boston to Budapest to Berlin, and now, of course, Baylor. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nancey Murphy.
Thank you so much, Chris, and it's just a delight to be here and get to see you again after these several years. And to continue the alliteration, Boston, Berlin, whatever, Baylor, I'm back at Baylor. So I was delighted to be invited to come here, but I was actually quite shocked when I discovered that the topic was going to be technology. But then the organizers would have had no idea what a technophobe I am. And we need other words. I was trying to coin one. Techno-incompetent, techno-hater, but those don't sound very good, so I'll just stick with technophobe. And to give you an idea about my level of incompetence, over the weekend my computer conked out. And so I had to phone Fuller's tech service to get help getting it running again. And one suggestion was, have you plugged it in? And what I really admired, and it just shows the lovely Christian personality of the people that work in our offices, he managed to suggest plugging it in without the least hint of condescension in his voice. But I have been very brave about one bit of technology. I brought this for show and tell, and of course, since I don't do PowerPoint, you all can't see it. But what it is, it's a scan of a brain, and I found out one book earlier that to put a brain scan on the cover of your book, you have to own the copyright of the brain. And so I persuaded somebody when I was lecturing in Aberdeen to get a brain scan for me. It's kind of a normal-looking brain, but I like to think it's a tiny bit bigger than most. But anyway, I brought it for show and tell because my main topic actually is going to be the relevance of neuroimaging, the latest development in the development of neuroscience for thinking about theological issues. And my major point is that the developments that have gone on in neuroscience in the last 20, 30 years have made it necessary for us Christians to reevaluate the body-soul or body-mind dualism that has been presupposed for most of the centuries of Christian history. And there are all sorts of theological issues that need to be rethought in light of the rejection of dualism, the replacement of dualism by what I'll call non-reductive physicalism. But I chose to write about the topic of the image of God. And it's partly because that's such an important aspect of Christian teaching about human nature. But then also when Chris mentioned the title of my book, Did My Neurons Make Me Do It?, I noticed that a couple of you chuckled. And I'm pretty famous for only being able to come up with really dumb and pedantic sounding titles. But my title for this one is Brain Imaging and the Image of God. And I thought that was pretty clever. A brief overview of what I'm going to cover. First, I'm going to give you just a very short history of the development of neuroscience. Second, I'm going to talk about why the developments in neuroscience are relevant to the issue of dualism. And if dualism is being called into question by the sciences, then the next question is, okay, what should a Christian's view of human nature be? And that's what I'll focus on the most. And the topic, the terminology that I ordinarily use for the position that I recommend is non-reductive physicalism. And I use that largely because by profession I'm a philosopher, and that's simply the term that we use in philosophy. But I'll talk a little bit later about possible alternatives to that. But the physicalism part is meant to say that we are composed entirely of the same stuff that all of the rest of the physical creation is made of. But the non-reductive part is to say that is not at all to deny what we think of as our higher human capacities: rationality, complex emotional capacities, moral responsibility. That was the point of Did My Neurons Make Me Do It? And in particular for us theology types, it is not to deny our capacity to be in relationship with God. Third, I'm going to talk about what the image of God has been taken to mean in Scripture, and then what difference it makes to our understanding of ourselves as being created in the image of God if we switch from a dualist to a physicalist understanding of our essence. And then, if I don't run out of time, I'll finish up with one important take-home message for Christian ethics. So first off, how has neuroimaging revolutionized neuroscience? And here I'm relying primarily on the writings of Scottish neuropsychologist Malcolm Jeeves. He writes that as recently as 1783, the English lexicographer Samuel Johnson had a stroke. And the result of that was that he couldn't talk. But even as recently as the 18th century, people didn't realize that that had something to do with his brain, and they tried to cure his inability to talk by putting blisters on his neck. Ouch. But by 1861, a scientist by the name of Paul Broca had a patient with damage to the left hemisphere and figured out that it was actually the brain damage that resulted in his inability to talk. And so we still refer to that particular region of the brain as Broca's area. Now, you can't give a talk on brain damage and human capacities without mentioning Phineas Gage. How many of you have heard of Phineas Gage? Yeah. This is a railway worker. He was in charge of packing black powder to make tunnels. Back in the old days, you drill a hole, you put in black powder, you put sand on top of it, and then with a rod about this big around, you tamp it down. and then you set off the charge. And he got distracted, and somebody didn't put in the sand. So he goes tamping the black powder, and it blows the rod out, goes through his left cheek and out through the top of his head. A rod about this big. And he didn't even lose consciousness. He reacquired pretty much everything that we would think of as his intellectual capabilities. But the strange thing was it completely changed his personality. Beforehand, he had been very reliable, very upstanding, and afterwards he was described as feckless, impulsive, and his doctor says Gage was no longer Gage. He ended up his life as a circus performer, being, shown around as this miraculously living person who'd had his brain damaged. But what's happened and another factor is that after World War II, there were so many soldiers with brain damage, and that was making it possible to correlate damage to particular parts of the brain with loss of particular cognitive capacities. And so that's where we begin to get closer correlations between what parts of the brain do what kinds of things in terms of our cognitive and emotional abilities and others. But what's really made a difference is the development of neuroimaging technology. And so you're probably all familiar with PET scans, positron emission tomography, and I think that's what produces these stationary pictures. But then the ones that show up in magazines and on television and everything are functional magnetic resonance imaging. And this is where it's possible to put radioactive substances into the blood, and then you can scan the brain while people are actually engaged in cognitive exercises. And by noticing where the higher concentrations of blood are, you know what parts of the brain are actually doing the work. And so this has resulted in just remarkably close correlations between very specific cognitive abilities and very, very specific brain regions and systems. And so the more of that stuff you read or hear about, the harder it becomes to think that it's not the brain that's responsible for all of the human capacities that we demonstrate. So what does all of this mean for dualism? Well, to put it very, very briefly, all of the capacities or faculties once attributed to the mind or soul, and these terms could be used interchangeably during certain periods in Western history. All of the capacities or faculties once attributed to the mind or soul are now being studied as brain functions. I've done surveys of audiences, and I've discovered that by far the largest number of Americans, both religious and non-religious, are dualists. But if you ask a dualist, well, what exactly do you mean by the soul? I think you get as many different answers as you've got people. And so when I've worked on this issue, I've sorted back through the historical literature, and I believe that the most comprehensive and brilliant account of the soul was developed by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And so some of the capacities that he attributed to the soul are 5 senses, our capacity to move around, locomotion, appetite, imagination, memory, various sorts of reasoning, and volition. But today, all of these have been studied by neurobiologists as functions of the brain. For example, much is known about the role of the brain in all of our 5 senses. In the case of vision, Impulses are transmitted from the eye to the visual cortex in the back of the head, and then information is transmitted forward so that we actually know what it is that we're looking at. Some of the more obscure cases of what Thomas took to be capacities of the soul provided the most interesting problems in current neuroscience. For example, Thomas wrote in Latin of the sensus communis, the common sense, but it doesn't mean common sense in our sense. He called this an interior sense, and it accounts for our capacity to correlate the input from the various external senses. This makes it possible, for example, to recognize that the bark, the brownness, the softness of the fur, and the smell are all properties of the same dog. Neuroscientists now study this process under the heading of the binding problem. Another of the capacities that Thomas attributed to the soul was the ability to recognize something as useful or friendly or dangerous. He called this the vis estimativa in Latin, and we share it with animals. This estimative power is particularly interesting from the point of view of brain science. What neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux writes about emotional appraisal is relevant to distinguishing Thomas's estimative power from the sensus communis. Quote, "When a certain region of the brain is damaged, namely the temporal lobe, animals or humans lose the capacity to appraise the emotional significance of certain stimuli, but without any loss in the capacity to perceive the stimuli as objects. The perceptual representation of an object and the evaluation of the significance of an object are separately processed in the brain. In fact, the emotional meaning of a stimulus can begin to be appraised before the perceptual systems have fully processed the stimulus. It is indeed possible for your brain to know that something is good or bad before it knows exactly what it is." So, to put it in Thomas's terms, the vis estimativa is a separate faculty from the sensus communis, and it works faster. Now, notice that I'm not arguing on the basis of neuroscience for Thomas's concept of the soul. I'm taking Thomas's concept of the soul and separating out two of the functions or capacities that he attributed to the soul and showing you the way that these can be precisely now studied as brain processes. I can't possibly give you an adequate account of all of the ways in which neuroscientists are studying what we would call mental processes, or what earlier thinkers would call capacities of the soul. But as the evidence mounts up, it becomes more and more obvious that these capacities will all be explained in terms of brain processes, along with social and cultural contributions, of course. So for most neuroscientists, the answer to the question, what is a human being, is settled. We're complex physical organisms whose large neocortex gives us capacities for language, finely modulated emotion, advanced reasoning, all of which contribute to human culture. In other words, we have got good reason to adopt a physicalist account of human nature. Now, there's such a huge stereotype that science and religion are always in opposition. And so when I argue for a physicalist account of the person, I'm always accused of being just one more theologian who has studied science, and I've given up Christian orthodoxy because I've knuckled under to the science. And so it's really important for you all to know that the biblical scholars and the theologians had come to the same conclusion starting a long time earlier than the neuroscientists. One of my reasons for talking about the slow development of neuroscience was so that you would realize that it's only been, say, in the last 30 years that the neuroscientists have known enough to be able to make these physicalist conclusions. But exactly 101 years ago, Old Testament professor by the name of H. Wheeler Robinson wrote a book which was hugely influential, arguing that there is no body-soul dualism in the Old Testament. And by the 1950s, most theologians and New Testament scholars had concluded that there's no body-soul dualism in the New Testament either. So note that this is a long time in advance of the so-called decade of the brain in the 1990s. But how then do we explain the fact that from approximately the year 150 to approximately the year 1950, most Christians were dualists? It's easier to explain in the case of the Old Testament. Around the year 250 BC, the Old Testament was translated into Greek, called the Septuagint. And the most common word translated as soul in our older English versions of the Bible, such as the King James, is the Hebrew word nephesh. Now, I have never studied Hebrew, but my understanding is that Hebrew has a smaller vocabulary than English, and so the same word will be given a wider variety of functions. And so the word nephesh first refers to the neck or throat, but because it's the throat through which we breathe, nephesh also can mean breath. And because if you're dead, you're no longer breathing, it can also mean the life breath. And so if you're alive and breathing, then nephesh can mean a living being. So it's got this broad spectrum of meanings. And I was just thinking the other day about some of the funny results that you get when you take King James translations of Scripture, and the word nephesh has been translated as soul. One of these is Psalm 7, verses 1 through 2. O Lord my God, in thee do I put my trust. Save me from them that persecute me, lest he tear my soul like a lion, rending it in pieces. Now, lions tearing souls into pieces, that's really odd. But remember, the first meaning of nephesh was throat. And what do lions go for when they attack you? The throat. And so all of the current versions translate it something like, lest he tear me apart like a lion. But it would make a whole lot more sense to translate it as, lest he tear my throat like a lion. Now, the New Testament. Here I rely primarily on New Testament theologian, or New Testament scholar, James Dunn. And he's made a distinction between what he calls an aspective account of human nature and a partitive account of human nature. And he warns us about making too sharp a distinction here. But he says, in general, Greek thinkers, when they talk about human nature, are interested in a partitive account. What are the essential parts or ingredients that make up a human being? What the Hebraic thinkers were interested in is what he calls an aspective account. What are the various aspects or dimensions that human beings participate in? And so if we think about what Jesus meant when he says, for instance, love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind, or all your heart and soul and strength, he would have been using probably the Aramaic word nabsha, which is very close to the Hebrew word nephesh, and consequently what that word there in that context most likely meant for him was life. Love the Lord your God with your whole life. And Paul, of course, knew both his own Hebraic tradition, but also the Greek philosophical world. And his writings have been most studied in this regard. And what Dunn says about Paul is, after the resurrection of Jesus, no account of human nature in existence so far was adequate to take account of the resurrection of Jesus. And so Paul is really, really hard to interpret because he was essentially having to make up a new theory of human nature in order to explain how it could be that we creatures of flesh could possibly be resurrected the way Jesus had been. So, So what is the alternative to dualism? Well, I want to go back to the two different creation stories in Genesis. And I'm going to start with the older one. And then I'll move on to the more recent one that focuses on the image of God. Listen to two English translations of the second account of creation of humans in Genesis 2:7. This is from King James. And Jehovah God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. More recent translations. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Slight differences, but evocative of two radically distinct views of human nature. The first introduces the dualist concept of the soul and has often been misread as saying that God breathed a soul into the body and it became a human being. The second translation recognizes that the Hebrew word nephesh, based on its various uses throughout the Hebrew scriptures, is better translated as living being. But what even the second translation fails to show is a literary device in Hebrew that adds emphasis to the materiality of the human. The term man translates the Hebrew word Adam. It's not a man's name, but a generic term for humans. The word for ground is Adamah, and so it's a pun. Adam formed from Adamah. And it's a literary device that highlights the dusty origins of our species. We can recapture the imagery in English by describing ourselves as humans made from humus. So the passage tells us that God's breathing makes the dust creature come to life. What then does the Christian tradition with its Hebraic roots have to say to our question of human nature? And remember that the biblical authors were not concerned, as were the Greek philosophers, with the question, what parts are we made of? Their interests were in relationships to one another, to the natural world, and especially to God. Now, the image of God. I've got a translation of the relevant text, Genesis 1:26-27, which I'm taking from Jürgen Moltmann's book, God in Creation. Moltmann says, the text which provides the basis for the concept of likeness to God already presents us with difficulties when we come to translate it. Here we shall take the following translation as our starting point. And God, Elohim, said, let us make human beings as our image, as our very form. They shall rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and beasts on earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And God created human beings as his image. As man and woman, he created them. Now, you go to look up image of God in reference works, and one of the first things you will be told is there may have been more words written about this particular biblical passage than any other passage in the Bible. And so my response is, eek, I throw up my hands in despair. But until quite recently, there were two primary interpretations. One emphasizes the ruling over the animals. And so the suggestion is that the image of God is the capacity to rule, and sometimes it's been translated to subjugate. The other primary interpretation recognizes the relationality of man and woman. And so for a long time, these were just parallel alternatives. But more recently, when the story is put into its historical context, it was written during the monarchy. And so one of the concerns of the biblical author would have been to distinguish what it means for the Hebrews to have a king as opposed to the kings of the other peoples around them. And for the other peoples, it was the king only who was the image of God. And we can put together the relationality and the ruling interpretations by saying that this is a democratization of the concept of image of God. All humans are made in God's image. And notice the really striking feminist twist here, that the passage would specify man and woman as ruling over creation. For years, the image of God was interpreted as intelligence, and it was attributed to the soul. And so now, no soul, so what instead? Done again, I find very helpful. The image of God isn't a special part of us. Rather, it's about what we are called to do. We are called together to be God's representatives on earth, caring for other living beings. Now, at this point, there would be a lot of ways to follow up on this bit of biblical interpretation, but the command to rule other creatures has been taken as license to exploit, or at least Christians have been accused of taking that passage as license to exploit. And so I want to start with a theological comment. First of all, for Christians, we have to read the creation stories in light of the whole Christian narrative. James McClendon, my favorite Baptist theologian, argued that the stories of origin have less to do with what happened back then than they do with the future. Our calling is to grow together, males and females, into the image of Christ. And then it's Christ, the perfect human, who finally is the perfect image of God. And Jesus' teachings on the kingdom of God is the blueprint or foretaste of the end of the story. Now, since I've talked about the end of the story, I need to insert something about the afterlife. We're so conditioned to think that afterlife means immortality of the soul that I can't give a lecture like this without talking about resurrection. And so to argue for physicalism is not to deny the afterlife. It's rather to emphasize the importance of bodily resurrection. It's important to see how the contrasting accounts of life after death, resurrection versus immortality of the soul, lead to different attitudes toward kingdom work in this life. Lutheran theologian Ted Peters whimsically describes the dualist account of salvation as soul-ectomy. If souls are saved out of this world, then nothing here matters ultimately. If it is our bodily selves that are saved and transformed, then bodies and all that go with them matter, families, history, and all of nature. Jewish scholar Neil Gilman lends weight to my suggestion. His book, titled The Death of Death, argues that resurrection of the body, rather than immortality of the soul, is the only authentically Jewish conception of life after death. Why are physicalism and resurrection important to Jews? For many reasons, Gilman replies, and I would want to say for Christians equally. Quote, because the notion of immortality tends to deny the reality of death of God's power to take my life and to restore it. Because the doctrine of immortality implies that my body is less precious, important, even pure, while resurrection affirms that my body is no less God's creation and is both necessary and good. Because the notion of a bodiless soul runs counter to my experience of myself and others. It's indispensable for another reason. If my body inserts me into history and society, then the affirmation of bodily resurrection is also an affirmation of history and society. If my bodily existence is insignificant, then so are history and society. To affirm that God has the power to reconstitute me in my bodily existence is to affirm that God also deeply cares about history and society. Now, what I'm missing in Gilman's comments there is it's not just that the concept of resurrection shows that bodies and societies and history are important, but bodies and society and history and the whole of the natural world are important. And so I want to talk just about one of many ethical consequences that I think we should take away from consideration of physicalism and resurrection. I've come to be a little bit disappointed with my fellow Christians for the lack of concern with preservation of the natural world. There are scientific and theological features of physicalism that make it particularly relevant. A doctoral student of mine recently wrote a book on ecological ethics, and he says we shouldn't think of ourselves merely as physical beings, but given our knowledge of ecology, we now have to think of ourselves as eco-physical beings. And he says, ecological ethics must become central to Christian ethics. We are a part of the Earth's ecology. The laws of ecology are as significant to our survival as that of our biosphere are the laws of physics. They must be taken into account as we strive to live in closer accord with them. Mustall states, quote, "As physical organisms, we humans are subject to all the patterns, principles, limits, and house rules that govern the existence of all organisms living with us on Earth. We must work within the independencies, resources, and constraints imposed upon us by the biosphere and all its systems. We are bound up within a system of checks and balances, controls, and feedback loops that we must learn about and obey. Even in this day of our enormous technical and energetic power, these ecological realities circumscribe our existence," end quote. The house rules that Mustall lists include the recycling of finite resources, the facts of energy flow and exchange, the webs of food chains, population dynamics, the concepts of carrying capacity, and ecological footprint. So I need to sum up, and I wanted to end by talking about terminology. I taught a seminar last fall with my colleague in systematic theology, Veli-Matti Karkkonen, and he doesn't like my term non-reductive physicalism because he thinks it places too much emphasis on the physical, and the non-reductive part tends to get forgotten. And the term that he likes better comes from John Polkinghorne, which is dual aspect monism. But by the time we finished the course, we had decided that the term we really need in theology is multi-aspect monism. And to make that point, I'm going to read a passage which is James Dunn's conclusion to his chapter on Paul's account of human nature. And I hate to do this in public because I often choke up, but it's just so beautiful. In sum, Paul's conception of the human person is of a being who functions See, I'm already doing that. Within several dimensions. As embodied beings, we are social, defined in part by our need for and ability to enter into relationships, not as an optional extra, but as a dimension of our very existence. Our fleshness attests to our frailty and weakness as mere humans, the inescapableness of our death, our dependence on satisfaction of appetite and desire, our vulnerability to manipulation of these appetites and desires. At the same time, as rational beings, we are capable of soaring to the highest heights of reflective thought. And as experiencing beings, we are capable of the deepest emotions and most sustained motivation. We are living beings animated by the mystery of life as a gift, and there is a dimension of our being at which we are directly touched by the profoundest reality within and behind the universe. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions for Dr. Murphy. There's a microphone on this side and here. If you'd like to come up. Make sure they're turned on.
You know, professors always complain when their classes are scheduled for right after lunch because they know that the lunch will have put the students to sleep. And of course, we neuroscientists know the reason for that. All the blood from up here has gone down to your tummies. But I assume some of you are awake.
Hi. So perhaps my question is more a thought experiment. But from your talk, what would be the implications of death? What does it mean for somebody to die then?
One of the primary reasons that some conservative theologians object to physicalism is the belief that the New Testament commits us to the doctrine of the intermediate state, meaning conscious awareness of God between the death of the body and the general resurrection. Calvin insisted on that. The Catholic Church has also. And so the simplest answer to what happens between your death and our general resurrection is that we're just plain dead like the other animals. But in order to accommodate that notion of the intermediate state, it's important to try to take that issue into consideration. And I've been talking with one of my students about the question of whether we can actually speak meaningfully about what's going on for someone who is with God in whatever sense that means, but outside the temporal physical universe, which is only where we know how to define what a length of time stands for.
Hi, I don't want to quarrel in the least with the content of what you were saying about the picture of human nature we should have. And it seems to be both true and important that Christians have often misunderstood their own tradition in that respect and adopted a view that is, on its own merits, implausible. But I did have some doubts about how much work the contemporary neuroscience was really doing in motivating that shift. And here'd be one way of expressing the doubt. One worry people sometimes have of this science is it's primarily, as it stands, a science of correlation rather than explanation. That we discover areas of the brain are active in association with certain kinds of consciousness, but it seems that gets us nowhere at all to understanding the deep mystery of how it could be that a thing like this could have conscious states. And so that's not to say it's not interesting, but to say that it doesn't give us a reason to identify the brain activity with the conscious states. So maybe this would be a way of putting it. is there anything the neuroscientists might have discovered that would have favored dualism? And if the answer is no, then how could it be the case that what they did discover serves as evidence against dualism?
Lots of questions wrapped into one. First of all, I don't think, and I think the neuroscientists would agree with me, we don't understand how consciousness at all arises. And there are some pessimists who say we never will. There are others who say, yeah, you know, we've got a long ways to go, but we'll get there. And so correlation of brain processes with cognitive abilities raises all sorts of questions about, you know, couldn't we be zombies and have our brains doing the same thing and nonetheless we'd be functioning as ordinary people. So that's one aspect of the question, and I tend to be optimistic on the side of science. Another issue is what's the difference between causation and correlation? And what has changed the minds of a number of us in theology is the very, very, very close correlations of very specific brain processes with very specific cognitive abilities. And one of the metaphors that used to be used to explain why brain processes were necessary but not sufficient for consciousness was, it was kind of like your mind or soul is a light bulb and your brain is a socket. And so if you break the socket, then the light bulb won't work. But what we've got to look at now is more like, you know, the neon lights in Las Vegas, where we've got all of these brain sockets and all of these light fixtures and so forth, and they're so very, very precisely correlated. And the more of that you read, the more you just become convinced that it's not, that the brain is not just the socket for the mind or soul. It's actually doing these, performing these functions.
Thanks, Dr. Murphy, especially for that that moving passage at the end.
I should have gotten a volunteer to come and read it for me.
I'm glad you read it. So I have two questions. One is along biblical lines. The other one's about the intersection of metaphysics and ethics. The biblical one is I've heard some dualists present this objection to non-reductive physicalists. That at least in some parts, both Jesus and Paul appear to make a distinction between a body and an immaterial soul. So Jesus says, "Fear not the one who can harm the body, but fear him who can harm the soul." And then Paul has a moment where he considers his third heaven ecstasy, and whether in the body or out of the body, I know not which. So Jesus and Paul believed in a soul, and that, at least that's along some hermeneutical lines, that suggests that we ought to. And then maybe I'll just
Let me
say
answer
that
that first. That's the value of the aspective versus partitive distinction. We use the word soul all the time, and we're not referring to an immaterial part of us. My soul longs for you. Does that mean that there's just some immaterial part in there that's not connected with me physically that longs for you? No, we now use that word aspectively. And that's why I talked about Jesus' use of the word soul in repeating the Great Commandment. Love, and I was trying to get, there are two different quotations, and I was trying to get both of them so I'd have them ready for a question like this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. That is a physical part, but it's being used metaphorically. And mind, and strength. Your strength isn't a part of you, it's a capacity of the whole of you. And soul. So if you look at those other three terms, he's not very likely using soul as an immaterial part. in parallel with all of those other references to every aspect of you that matters.
Right.
And then that passage with Paul, I'm not going to touch that one because even the best of New Testament scholars are very much in disagreement about what that means.
Fair enough. So I'm sympathetic with ontologies that favor the physical, insofar as there appears to be this connection between one's metaphysics and one's ethics, and I think that's a bit present in some of your comments. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about whether holding to mind-body dualism as a metaphysical theory necessitates that you have to hold sort of dualisms about ethics, separating faith from reason, maybe, or the value of physical things or earthly things. So heavenly minded, you're of no earthly good, as Cash says. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Well, certainly body-soul dualism has played a significant role in the development of Christian ethics. I think, for instance, it was one of the things that led Christians to object to exposing and thereby killing infants, which was very common practice in the Roman Empire. But strangely, if you work at it, you can use dualism for pretty nefarious purposes also. For example, of course women have souls, but women, because of their biology, are much more bodily, whereas men, being the rational ones, are much more soulish. And so you can use body-soul dualism for purposes of substantiating inequality just as well as you can for substantiating our equality. Body-soul dualism obviously does not make it impossible for people to care about the things of this world. Some of the greatest exemplars of Christianity who have been body-soul dualists, I'm thinking, for instance, at the moment, of Teresa of Avila. She spent her whole life actually down on the ground reforming convents and doing the physical work of making Spain more like the kingdom of God. So you can be a dualist and still care about all of this earthly stuff. It's just that being a dualist has allowed too many people to think, like my friend Ted Peters says, none of this matters, soulectomy, plop, off the souls go to heaven, and so we don't have to care about the environment or anything else in this world.
Thank you. I guess my question is this. As I'm hearing you today, obviously your physicalism is specifically restricted to an account of human persons. But as I've heard you, part of the motivation for that is the increasing implausibility of a dualistic account in light of neuroscientific advance. And my question is, does your physicalism extend not just sort of locally to human persons and maybe other living organisms, but do you hold to a kind of global ontological physicalism where physicalism is just all there is in reality in general? So it would be like a metaphysical physicalism. And if so, what implications does it have for how we think about theology? On the other hand, if you say, no, I don't, I actually think that there's something beyond the physical reality, then I guess my question is, why isn't that just as implausible as a dualistic account of human persons?
Well, both physicalism and materialism have been used for two different purposes. One is a total metaphysical system that says that there is nothing but the physical, and that, of course, rules God out. So I specify that I'm talking about anthropological physicalism. I'm only denying that we have non-material souls. But I just want to correct something that you said. You said it was the neuroscience that's making dualism implausible. Well, it's the neuroscience that's bringing it up culturally. And so that is what sent me and my friend Warren Brown and Malcolm Jeeves and others to go and look at the scriptures, to look at the accounts of biblical studies, to look at the changes in the history of theology, and to discover that biblical scholars got there about 70 years sooner than the neuroscientists did. And so if we had done our homework on the theology and the biblical studies and found out that scripture somehow really requires dualism, then we would be in a very difficult position. But we're not. Jürgen Moltmann, I don't know how much neuroscience he studied, and Veli-Matti Karkkonen says if you asked Moltmann, is he a dualist, he'd be about as shocked as if you asked him, was he still beating his wife? So I've distracted myself by replying to the way you phrased the question. I'm agnostic about non-material beings apart from God and human souls. I would have to do just as much work on demons and angels and all of that stuff in order to speak authoritatively on that. And I just haven't done that.
Well, people often talk about neuroscience like it's the new frontier, and it's kind of animated by a hope that they're going to fill in all the gaps, and then you'll eventually have a completely physical account of things. So how do you preserve the non-reductive aspect of your physicalism without, like, how do you preserve the integrity of it without the hope that one day those gaps will be filled in and one day you'll have a complete set of knowledge? Is that something that you decided presuppositionally, that the soul had to be non-physical and you wouldn't ever have that information, or?
I'm not sure I'm following you. Part of your question is about gaps in our neuroscientific knowledge of how we work?
Yeah. So, okay, I've read things that have said, like, well, once we have imaging that catches up with the speed of things, we'll see the neural activity that's accounting for consciousness. And consciousness is basically the soul anyway, so one day we'll have that information. And people say, oh, it can be completely physical and it can be reduced to physical things. And you don't need that non-reductive.
There are two questions there. Can neuroscience ever show that there is no soul? And if you define the soul as consciousness, a couple of us were talking the other night about my friends Paul and Patricia Churchland, who are famous for their eliminative materialism, and they're trying to argue that we shouldn't talk in terms of consciousness, beliefs, desires, etc. And nobody, as far as I know, accepts that. We are conscious. It's obvious that we're conscious. And the question is, when and how will neuroscience be able to explain how consciousness emerges from our neural systems?
Yeah. Or just, how do you know that eventually we won't arrive at that information? Like, how do you preserve that gap as something that we'll never capture?
I don't see what gap you're trying to preserve.
Like that the soul is something other than just neural activity.
There is no soul.
Okay. But then there's like a sort of like a discourse divide, because some people are saying soul and some people are saying consciousness, and there's like religious.
I'm trying to teach people to talk differently.
Okay.
Some of us have a theory that some words ought to be put on the shelf for 30 years, and then you can bring them back and use them again. Soul goes on the shelf for 30 years, all right?
Well, I was pretty excited actually that you were going to be at the conference, because we had to study your book, Bodies and Souls, or Spirited Bodies, and our course, What is Life, last semester. So this is a bit of a geek out moment for me. But quick question. We've been framing this debate in terms of, especially today, less so in your book, but today, in terms of substance, almost Cartesian dualism, or physical monism. But if you're talking about history, and especially Aquinas or Aristotle, that brings up the whole soul is the act of the body sort of position. Could you address some of the range of positions that kind of exist on a continuum between, like pure monism or Cartesian dualism?
Actually, I don't think I can, because there have just been so many different conceptions of what the soul is. The one thing that I will address is the Aristotelian Thomist position. And there are a number of Catholic scholars who feel perfectly comfortable saying that the soul is the substantial form of the body. But my objection to that is, I think that the Aristotelian and Thomist account of the whole of metaphysics is simply incommensurable in the scientific sense with the whole of our worldview now. And you can't just go plucking out bits and pieces of Aristotelianism because you like them for your theology. The concept of form just does not have any role to play in our contemporary worldview.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk, and I've very much admired your work over the years. I'm a physician by training, but also have some training in theology. So when you show PET scans and CT scans and MRIs, I see them in a diagnostic sense. But I also have been very skeptical of their more than correlative value with respect to who we are as human beings. We know that physiology can be documented with PET scans and other scans, but I'm not on the same page as you yet, if ever, I think, on the issue of whether causation will ever be established to anybody's satisfaction. I would like to, though, go back to the point that the young woman was raising, that, and I won't use the word soul.
Okay.
But I would like to ask the same question, but in a different context, and that's the non-reductionist part of your term. Mm-hmm. In fact, particularly the multi-aspectual, because what I'm hearing you say, on the one hand, is very reminiscent of the Christian philosopher Herman Dooyeweerd's idea of the cosmos, and he was struggling with reductionism already in the 1940s and 50s. And he tried to fight that reductionistic tendency by looking at all of the cosmos and individuals and relationships in a multi-aspectual, non-reductionist way. Mm-hmm. And I have always found that helpful in trying to resist a reductionist tendency, particularly physicalism. And that's where I get to my main point. It sticks in me the wrong way to use the word physicalism, partly because it's got a history that I think is dangerous for Christians, maybe some Christians more than others, depending on their backgrounds. And I would encourage you to keep the non-reductionist multi-aspectual part, but really think through the physicalism part.
Yes.
And not necessarily go to the monism either, because we're in the ism tradition, unfortunately, in Christianity. And I would suggest that a lot of creative minds be brought, maybe even a lottery, to look at who could think of the best alternative to physicalism, but keep the non-reductionism.
Yeah, I've come to believe that atomism, determinism, reductionism are a collection of ideas that have been a major aspect of the whole modern worldview. And I think it's only now that enough creative minds are coming together and are working on the philosophical issues in order to be able to answer the question, why is it not the case that higher human capacities can be reduced to mere neural functions? So I see us at a real tipping point in terms of worldviews.
At least one more. Given this is a conference on technology, so can a robot be a person?
Oh, no. Well, I follow Stanley Hauerwas in choosing not to use the word person as a philosophical term. I only use it as the singular for people, since we don't have a singular word for people, just like we don't have a non-gendered singular word for cattle. And the problem is that however you define it, it seems to let in some beings that we don't want to recognize as persons, and it also tends to leave out others that we do. Stanley Hauerwas has an essay, I won't get the title exactly right, but my great Aunt Susie isn't much of a person, but she's still my great Aunt Susie. And so that's why, even if I could figure out the complexities of, first of all, how do you get consciousness in a living organism? Second, only after we answer that could you answer the question whether something built of silicone, whatever, could become conscious or not. And then third, would we count that as a person or not? And so for all three reasons, I can't answer that question.
I'm actually going to ask a question, and this may be the last one.
I thought you were going to tell me I could escape.
No, not quite yet. So you said early on that this was an area where theologians need to spend more energy. So this is a methodological question. So what kind of advice would you give theologians pursuing this kind of thing so that they avoid the traps of modernism, the modernist theologies that dominated much of theology in the early part of the 20th century?
Non-dualism has been presupposed by all major systematic theologians for so long that for me that's just a non-issue. I asked Veli-Matti Karkkonen, aren't we going to include some really good dualist theologians? And he said, well, there aren't any. So I don't have any specific advice to give there, particularly since I'm not a theologian. I would just say pay attention to the fact that mainstream Christian theologians and biblical scholars have not been dualists for, yea, these many years.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Nancey Murphy again.